Warning, the following video has flashing lights and also includes content that may be deemed inappropriate for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Dr. Dennis Carroll, you have found your way through the darkness and the werewolf-infested forest and past my Dogman guards and into the fox den for another episode of Midnight Lycanthropy here on LordeStarfox Radio. I am very hungry though, and I do see you brought me nutrition. Absolutely delicious. And now that I am fully revamped, recharged, and my shackles have been completely released by Dr. Carroll, it is once again time for us to take a walk into the madness.
Stood up. I said, oh my god, it's a werewolf. And everybody in the car freaked out.
My creatures of the night, yes, welcome back to Midnight Lycanthropy here on LordeStarfox Radio. Dr. Dennis Carroll, again, has already found his way to the late night fire and has set it up for us. You should recognize Dennis Carroll. Why? He is a bi-weekly host. How you doing tonight, Doc?
Yeah, how you doing tonight?
Excellent stuff, man.
I've been doing a lot of research here and doing some writing on my next book. It's coming along pretty well. Still got a good ways to go, but it's getting there.
This is good. Yeah, I understand how that is, my friend. All I do is edit and repeat. Again, no complaints because, like I always say, you need guests and content to create stuff. Yeah, I understand the grind, my friend. Like I said, after you and I get done tonight, I would like to finish a video for Camp Nightmare Fuel, my little sister podcast about giant spiders. Still got about 40 minutes left on that. So that probably translates to about at least an hour and a half, maybe more. So I feel you.
Yeah, that is an interesting, definitely interesting subject. I have looked into and done a lot of research on the Native American belief that the what we call spider women, that some women supposedly under certain circumstances can turn into something very much like giant spiders or black widow spiders and get rid of their male counterparts that way. So there's a lot of fascinating stuff when it comes to the giant spider category.
Straight up creepy as heck. Yet to the audience, that is not what Dr. Carroll and I are here to talk about tonight. If you are interested in things outside of the realm of Dogman sightings, potential werewolf information, missing people, well, then you want to tune in to, as I said, my little sister podcast called Camp Nightmare Fuel with my co-host Barb Hartman. So I encourage everyone to pop over there if you have some more takes and interests and things outside what we cover here. Yet Dennis has got some messed up stuff tonight we're going to dive into. I'm going to throw you the mic, Dr. Carroll, and well, let's try to figure out what the heck's happening, eh?
Well, I think we're going to go into a little dark territory tonight, sort of cross the line of the taboo into some things that people don't talk very much about concerning Sasquatch, Dogman, and yes, werewolves. Abduction by sometimes Sasquatch, sometimes Dogman, and sometimes a werewolf category as well. there are a lot of cases on record, supposedly, of people being abducted, male and female, by Sasquatch. And also, there are a few of supposed dogman abductions as well. Some people that encounter these dark entities are abducted by them for periods of time. There is one very interesting case, I think, is on record of a family, a small family that was abducted by Sasquatch, and later on, when they got away or were rescued, I forget exactly how it went. Whether they were rescued, I think it was rescued uh, by a group of men. But anyway, there was a female, young female, in the family, and 9 months later, she gave birth to supposedly a half male, half man, half Sasquatch baby, and disappeared both of them. To this day, we don't know what supposedly happened to that, but there are certain agencies that are very, very concerned and interested in these kind of things. And there's also a lot of talk about feral people. You know, we've talked about those before that may be connected to breeding with Sasquatch and even Dogman to a certain extent. It's very flaky stuff when you think about it. That, but these people are usually, you know, abducted against their will. This is nothing that they usually want to happen to them, supposedly. But there is a lot of talk that maybe a lot. Some of these feral people are definitely intermingling with some of these other type creatures out there. And that may be why their population is kept to a certain extent out deep in the forest for certain purposes of breeding possibilities. And, you know, when you go look back in time in a lot of history, you see that the Native American tribes watched over their women very closely, and it's not only because of other hostile tribes. That was one purpose, but also they felt that Sasquatch was often looking at the females for other purposes than just spying on them. That there was some abduction that went on, and some that, and most of the time, when these females were abducted, they were never seen again. It is thought that probably, you know, they were kept back for breeding purposes or something very similar to that. And then you got the interesting cases of werewolves that I don't know if you're familiar with the original of The Howling, the movie, but it tells at the very beginning of it, especially the book. The book is a lot more interesting in many ways than the movie. But in the book, the first part of the story is about a woman who is by a werewolf. And when this happens, she not only supposedly gets pregnant by the werewolf, but also is cursed by the werewolf to become a werewolf herself because of this. And that is another thing in legend that says that if a werewolf, you know, has relations with a woman, that woman can become lycanthropic too because of that. And of course, their offspring would definitely be so. And that's very interesting. And you know, when you go back also into the other annals of history and find out that the incubus and the succubus can sometimes appear in wolf form. Take a look at Dracula, okay? Especially the movie by Francis Ford Coppola. Dracula appears very much like a werewolf in this thing, more so than a vampire. And he actually has relations with a woman before he bites her and turns her over into being a vampire. He first appears in very distinct wolf form. So it is thought that a lot of these incubus and succubus demons that have relations with men and women can often take the forms of beasts like lions, tigers, bears, or wolves, or panthers. The list goes on and on. And when you get deep into the Appalachian Mountains and the witchcraft that goes on there, supposedly, witches are able to turn themselves into supposedly Black Panthers. And these Black Panthers can then for have relations with people on the basis of that too. So you got some very, very flaky stuff, but you never hear anybody talking about this very much. It's sort of a very taboo subject. It's sort of like the 500-pound gorilla in the room that nobody wants to talk about, but it's there definitely, and there are definitely some distinct cases. So I would, caution women, especially women who go out Bigfoot hunting or dogman hunting or whatever the situation. If you're out monster hunting, be very careful if you're a female, especially if you're in your menstrual period or whatever. These things should pick up on that. So that is another factor that we have to look and consider when we're doing any kind of monster hunting out there in the woods, especially if you have a female companion along with you. It can get very flaky, definitely.
Yeah, that is straight up nightmare fuel and totally disturbing as heck. Do you think there is out to that, or do you think it's potentially more hearsay, or how do you feel about all that?
I think there's some truth to it. I'm not going to say it's all fact, because there's a lot of ambiguous stuff when it comes to this, because there's a lot of reporting and things that are never reported that we don't know about. But I think there is a factor of it definitely in there, because it was thought so much, especially by the Native Americans and by the early frontiers people, that there were other things out there in those woods for females, for women to be very cautious about.
Jeez, on crow. Yeah, that's some gnarly stuff for sure, my friend, eh?
Yeah, and also men, the males, they run a chance of actually participating in some of this stuff too with female Sasquatch, female Dogman, and other entities like that. They can. There's another side to the coin, definitely not just for the females. There have been reports of, I think there was one very famous report of a man who was supposedly abducted by a female Sasquatch who had very amorous intentions on her part, and supposedly, had her way with him. And he talked about escaping from the cave with her, but and it supposedly um, kind of warped him mentally after that. He said that after that experience, he was never the same, and of course, that would be very fundamentally lifestyle changing to you to have something like that happen. And he said, I think he eventually ended up, having some mental illness problems associated with that. It really, I think, did a big emotional type of a upheaval for him in many ways. And that would definitely be. I mean, that is just like, men and women. Men, just like women, can be assaulted. They can be, to a certain extent. And yes, that goes along with that. So we got to understand that these things that are out there that are watching us or maybe very interested in us, may be interested in us for other reasons than we really consider sometimes. Um, and if someone like Sasquatch, especially, has to propagate and breed that way, they're definitely going to be on the lookout for females.
Yikes. That's so messed up right there. You know what that reminds me of? I believe his name was Albert Osman. Do you remember that encounter? And do you think he was telling the truth?
Yeah, I remember that. That was very interesting. And that's very much like the one I was mentioning, the guy that was abducted and taken to a cave kind of a thing. It had a lot of ramifications of the same thing that happened with that. And, and another thing that, we have to consider too, supposedly some people are contacted telepathically by these things. And that could be an interlude to, I will say, the beginning of some type of assault.
Yeah, that's just a whole nother level of disturbing stuff for sure, man. Yikes.
So, if you're out in the woods, definitely, especially alone, and it's never a good idea to go out there alone. Okay, absolutely. I have done that in several instances myself. I'm guilty of it, being a kind of a lone wolf guy that I am. But I was always able to be in close contact with someone. I have a walkie-talkie or some way, and an appointed time and an appointed place to show up. And so it's always good to have a backup plan on anything like that. But when it comes to abduction, and that's the flaky part, why, you got to look at the big picture. Why is this being abducting you? It's doing it for a reason. I don't think it's just because it may be lonely. You know what I'm saying? It may be driven by urges many times.
So bizarre right there for sure. Do you think Dogman is paranormal, extraterrestrial, or physical?
The jury is kind of still out on that. I will say this about Dogman. I have seen some dark attributes to him that leads me to believe some of these Dogman encounters are definitely the product of black magic and conjuration to a certain extent. We've got to understand that some of these things may be guardians of the land put there by the curses of Native Americans over the land. A lot of times Native Americans would curse the land, or would call it cursing it. I would sort of say they were calling it locking it in, so to speak, to the way they wanted it to be watched over by certain entities that they would, call forth to do this. And Sasquatch, Dogman, other things besides that could possibly be guardians of the land put there by these North American natives that do these things with the land. You can call it cursed land, so it is kind of cursed in a way in that respect. But when you invade these areas, and these areas still have that patina of magic supposedly over them, you could activate these creatures that are set there to be guardians, and they may start stalking you. They may start, actively hunting you because that's part of their job. It's sort of like being bodyguards for the land itself. When you activate them, you may be in a very precarious, a very dangerous situation, whether you know it or not. It's very much like, and I've run into occasion, mountain lions. When you enter the territory of a mountain lion, he immediately begins to stalk you, whether you know it or not. And I had an old ranger tell me one time years ago, when you see the mountain lion, it's usually too late by then because he's got you right where he wants you usually, and that may be the very same way these things do. Absolutely. I mean, when you enter their territory and they know you're there, when you enter their territory, they begin to stalk you and watch you very closely. I have seen many instances. I felt it my own self of being watched by the very same things that I was hunting, knowing that they were out there watching me too. So the hunter sometimes becomes the hunted, and you don't want that to happen if you can help it, but it does happen.
Wow. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. That's a good way to look at it, like you said, because jury is definitely still for sure out on the topic, because the more I dive into it, just the more confused I find myself becoming. Yet it is just truly baffling for sure, eh?
Well, here's one thing we must consider: a lot of these things don't all have just one answer. They can be very many different factors, many different avenues that we need to look at when you consider this. Like the Bigfoot that I ran into, he did not act like a normal animal would. I mean, he disappeared so quickly from my sight. There was no way, and I've said this to a lot of people over the years, there was no way he possibly could have gotten away from me that quickly without me seeing it in very heavy woods. They were very heavy brush that I was in. And there was no way. It was just like there 1 second and gone the next. And I've often said, did he step into the tree, or did he become the tree? Did he step into did he part a curtain and go into some other time and space place, some liminal place in between places? I don't know. It's very interesting because his attributes does not follow along many paths of what we call the natural world. These beings are something I think other than just plain natural. There's something else going on here, and I think it may have a spiritual connection, definitely, whether it's dark or light, spiritual activity. I get the feeling sometimes a lot of it's very dark. It's very connected to that in many aspects, but and then you got another aspect you looked at, like I said earlier about the cursed land. It's as if these things are also guardians sometimes to certain areas like that. And if you trigger them, you may be, in for some bad times. Definitely. Because that's their job. When you put a guardian thing over something to guard and watch over something, it's going to do that. That's what it's there for. And you got to remember, if you activate that, you may have to face the consequences.
Yes, that is very true. Do you think these entities then are more guardians of areas, whether that's nefarious or for good purposes, or how do you feel these things are unfolding?
I think, like I said, they've been brought forth from the darkness, the spiritual darkness areas of our universe. And they will have a definite dark nature to them. Okay. I don't think they're anything fun that you're gonna sit around and try to play checkers with or anything. There's nothing like that. When you run into these type of things, it's usually not going to be a very pleasant experience most of the time. You may come away learning something, and hopefully you will come away. It's like we used to say about police officers. The best police officer in the world goes home every day at the end of the day. That's what you want to do. You want to get back, after your hunting expedition, definitely. So be very careful when you go and very respectful of the land. And there have been many instances, especially when I knew I was on, Native American land. I would bring maybe, some tobacco and leave it sort of as a gift, or something as a gift like that to the land itself. Not just, saying I was giving it to Sasquatch or Dogman or whatever, but just to the land itself. You learn to respect the land because the land is a big part and a big connection of all this. These things are connected to the land just like you and I are, and that's why, I tell people a lot of times it's good to kind of get barefooted every now and then and walk and connect with the earth itself through your bare feet and feel that connection and get grounded by that. It's not only just a physical thing, but it's a spiritual thing as well. And I think without a doubt, these things are grounded spiritually, whether it be dark or light. And like I say, I think most times it's dark, unfortunately, but they're grounded nevertheless. And you need to respect that. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely need to respect that for sure.
That's true. There's so many accounts of people disappearing, never to be seen again or heard of again, especially in a lot of these national parks and all that. And like I said, there are other contributing factors, but you got to wonder how many of these people, were disappeared this way. They got in the wrong place at the wrong time and ran into the wrong entity they shouldn't have. And we've got to understand you run that risk, and I'm not telling you need to be fearful. We don't need to deal with fear in that way. But we need to be cautious. We need to be smart. That's the thing about it. And you got to remember something, whatever it is that you're stalking or looking for in the way of monsters out there, they are, don't write them off as being stupid. They are incredibly intelligent. You need to respect that as well. These things have probably more knowledge than you and I would ever accumulate in one lifetime, especially natural knowledge of nature itself. And you need to respect that as well and understand what you're dealing with. These things are incredibly intelligent, very, very super sensitive, more so than you and I are. They know what your intentions are. They know what that gun you've got with you is for. They know what that knife on your side can do. They're smart. They're not stupid. So never write them off. Don't ever disrespect them.
Yeah, that would probably not be a very good thing for sure to find yourself on that list of, well, like you said, no longer existing. Pretty bizarre stuff. I was just reading earlier about a woman that survived being stalked by what she thought was some deranged human being, obviously, because he was following her all through the forest on one of the trails in the Appalachia. Yeah, creepy stuff.
A lot of times these things, I think they're very much like predators in that respect. Predators watch their prey. They watch for signs of weakness, of illness or age or whatever the relation may be to that. That's how they take down their prey. They look for the weaker links in the chain, the food chain. That's what they go after. And if you look like a victim, if waiting to happen somewhere, they're definitely going to get their attention. You might not want their attention in that way, definitely. So you need to, be careful how you present yourself out in the woods, especially if you're female. Definitely, because they may be more interested in you than the males in some ways for different purposes. So you need to understand you can become bait real quick if you're not careful. And you need to know how you can react to that if things go that way. and have a game plan in place for that, just in case. I've said that to a lot of monster hunters over the years, and I've kind of been guilty of it myself. Do you have a plan when you find the monster, or whatever it is you're looking for? You better have a plan in place. You better be ready for when you do finally find it, if you do, because things could go south very quickly. And a lot of these cases of people being abducted out in these national parks and forests, and this is a big thing that's going on year after year. Okay, I've said this before, and I'll stick by it. There is something out there. I can't say exactly what it is right now, but there is definitely something out there hunting the human race. And we need to understand that and be very careful. It's almost like being a living in a predator movie. Okay, something is out there watching you, and you need to be aware of that. Be very aware of your surroundings, your environment, and everything going on around you. Listen to the birds, listen to the animals around you. Be very careful how you go about this. I've spent a lot of times out, a lot of hours and days out in the woods and forests of this great country, and I've seen a lot. But every time you come back, you note that you've learned something new and different, and that's the way it goes. Be open to that, and you don't become nonchalant and think, "Oh, well, I know that before." Always have your mind, your spirit open to these things, and understanding what it is that you're dealing with, and the environment that you're in, because they definitely are that way. Okay, what you're looking for is definitely got that on you, without a doubt. So you got to realize that and be respectful of that as well, because there have been a lot of people that went out there in those forests that have never come back. And there's a very good reason for that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I could totally see that for sure. Unfortunately, way too many people definitely go vanishing in the national forest, which is beyond nightmare fuel. Definitely. Yikes. Have you been diving into anything else yourself, my friend, and working on any other werewolf projects, or what have you been up to?
Well, I've been looking at it from another direction, and more or less like the interdimensional type thing that may be going on here. And, I mentioned liminal places. There are liminal places. There are also liminal situations, and maybe even liminal beings out there that don't really belong here and are passing through or crossing over. If timelines do exist, and the string theory is true, and there are multiple universes and timelines, and if they cross from time to time, these things may go from one timeline to another. I think a lot of times the things that we sense and some of the memories that we have are left over, or maybe crossed over from other timelines. So there's a lot of that going on. And I think without a doubt that black magic can be tied into manipulating some of this stuff as well. We have to take that in consideration too. That I call it not opening a doorway in many ways. It's like parting a curtain and walking through. But there is an in between place, in between those realities. And there could be things that exist in that in between place, these liminal places. There may be monsters galore in there that we don't know about. But once in a while, they pass through the curtain and come into our reality. And I think that is a factor of some of the stuff that's going on, definitely, especially with things like Dogman and werewolves. We know what werewolves can do and where they come. Supposedly, the main type of werewolf, where it comes from, and how it is initiated into the realm of our reality. It is done so by the manipulation of reality by magic itself, the forces of nature and forces known and unknown contribute to this. So we got to understand that's another factor. I don't want to say it's all the same thing. You cannot paint all of this with one broad brush. Okay, this you never do that. But there are factors that we have to look at, and like I said before, it's like holding a diamond up. You have to see the many sides and facets of the diamond. You got to look at the whole big picture as much as possible to understand what it is you're looking at. So I like to look at the different avenues that may lead off the different rabbit holes, as people like to call them. They lead you into different avenues of thought and thinking, and consideration on a lot of this stuff. We still don't know. 99.9% of what we need to know is still unknown. But we need to keep chipping away at that.
Yikes. That is so creepy again, right there. That's really good, though. It seems like you have been doing a ton of research, like always, which is to be expected for sure. There's just so much stuff occurring out there. Have you had any good Dogman evidence come in your direction recently?
Well, I've heard several accounts that I'm going to definitely be looking into. There's one where supposedly a family was harassed by a group of dogmen. I think this was, in Kentucky, and they lived on the mountain near somewhere in Kentucky. I'm not sure exactly where at, but they had a farm, and supposedly they were harassed by a gang. They called it a gang of dogmen. It was these things were sort of acting like gang activity in a way, like the gangs you might run into on the streets of Brooklyn or something, like that. They said that they were, acting very much like that, and they were harassing this farm and the animals on this farm, and of course the people that lived there too. The family was not a real large family. I think it was about 5 or 6 individuals, and but they were having, I think, a hard time caused by this. And here's the interesting thing that kind of caught my eye about this. They said this had happened before and was kind of like a seasonal thing with them. And that's what I definitely want to, look into some more.
Well, that totally makes sense and does need to be looked into more for sure.
You need to consider the seasonal attributes of this thing. Maybe it may run with the phases of the moon, or it may run with certain, weather patterns. We need to look at that. We need to start looking at that. And here's the interesting thing about it. When we get to that kind of a situation, when consider all the factors in it, that will help us track these things a little bit better, and help us maybe get a little more information and knowledge of what we need on these things. So you got to look at the weather patterns. You got to look at the seasonal attributes of it, the moon phases. Was, a bright moonlit night that night? Was it, or dark of the moon? Whatever the situation was, you got to consider all the factors. It's like I was taught in law enforcement. You observe everything. You consider and take into consideration as much as absolutely possible on that situation. It tells you more that way.
Makes sense. Again, it's a really great way to approach it for sure. It's just trying to seep it all in and gather as much information as possible. Yet there's just so much information, it's literally so hard to cram it all into the good old filing cabinet upstairs in the brain sometimes, Yeah, that's what we're here for, I guess, eh?
Absolutely. And the main thing we need to consider also, we need not to hold back on our information. We need to have a network of information on all this stuff. We need to, connect up, talk to each other, present, things that we're working on, and just stay connected that way. Because the more transference of knowledge and information we do, the better it's going to be for everybody. So this communities, they don't need to close themselves off, like saying, oh, you're just paranormal. I don't do that. I do only cryptids, and all that. You can't do that. That's not a good thing to do. We do not need to close these communities off from each other, because then our information will get stagnant, and it'll be the same old thing over and over and over again. We need to interact on a broader basis to assimilate and accumulate this knowledge and information between each other. We need to be forthcoming and not hold back on this. That's the one thing that will determine whether we can be detrimental in our aspect and our study of these different subjects.
Preach, my friend. Very well stated. Isn't that all the truth? It is really hard sometimes to figure out where everything plugs in, though, that's for sure. It's got to be separated, but yet potentially could all correlate with each other, though, too, as well. How do you feel about that?
Absolutely, and especially, when we get a lot of reports and stuff. We need to file those. We need to have a better filing system on some of this stuff. I've been guilty of that in the past. If I had kept all the information of all the cases I've done for well over half a century now, I would be living in a warehouse probably. It would be probably a warehouse full of stuff. But I should have done that. And I'm guilty of that. You could go back and verbally kick yourself for doing something like that. I would do it, but I should have been better at in my filing system and keeping all the cases intact and all this other stuff. You don't think about when you're in the middle, you're in the heat of battle. You don't think about that until afterwards. That's just the way it goes sometimes, though. But we need to consider that too. That we need to keep our information filed correctly and keep it on tab so that not just us, that others can look at it as well.
Yep. Again, very well spoken. That's why I try to make sure I have my content out there digitally and virtually on YouTube. I also have it backed up on portable hard drives. And then I have my book, which is in document form, which is also through Google. So again, I have all the encounters covered in there. I cover them and talk about them in my videos. So yeah, no, it's totally important.
I'll tell you what, my friend, I learned the hard way a long time ago. You need to back up the backup too.
Yes. Isn't
Absolutely.
that the truth? Right. That's why I do that. Even though it's on YouTube, it's in the book. I do have the portable hard drive to back that up, like you said, because in a perfect world, your stuff doesn't go anywhere. But who knows, man? If something happens, you don't want all of your stuff just on one platform and for it to be vanished,
That's true. It's that old saying, you don't keep all your eggs in one basket. Something could happen to that basket. That's the problem. And I've had that. And I'll tell you what, I do not trust electronics. Okay. I'm old school. I don't trust electronics. I've lost too much on them.
You trust the pen and paper a little bit more, eh?
Yeah, a little bit more than I do that. I like hard copy too. Yeah, definitely.
You sound like Jody Cook. He's always saying that too. It's so funny because I was like, yeah, but you got your phone with you, man. All you got to do is click on it and look it up online. He's like, yeah, but I actually want the hard copy. Yeah, no, I understand for sure.
Yeah, Jody is old school like me. Yeah, I know him well.
That's so funny. I mean, look at earlier though. You are correct that even though technology in theory is supposed to work the way they tell you it is. I mean, you were trying to call me earlier. I was trying to call you. Apparently, said on both ends, no call is going through. So here is this thing that is supposed to work great, yet it was working faulty. But welcome to technology, yeah.
That's a very important statement there. Supposed. Yeah, if they would keep the promises, it would be much better, definitely. But it doesn't work that way sometimes, unfortunately. But when we accumulate so much information, we don't want it lost, definitely, because it's a lot of work to accumulate it. You definitely don't want to lose it. And it's like I've always said, and I tell people that a lot of times I say it over and over and over again with all the people that come to me with the stories and their experiences or whatever. I said, please write it down. If you're not if you don't want to write it down, record it somehow or another, because over time you will lose a lot of the aspects of it if you're not careful. You need to write it down, record it right then. I mean, I even I take a notebook with me out in the field. I take the field notes, because your mind can play tricks on you sometimes, and you need to record it instantly right then. Because if you're not careful, very important, very major stuff can be lost to history,
Yes, again, preach. Very well stated. That can be the truth for sure. It is something that, well, doesn't need to happen, but does. Meaning, look where you live, though. Imagine if we didn't have technology. I'm up here in Maine. It would take me quite a long time to get down to you if I had to walk or, use a horse or something and then take notes and have to come back and drive all across country again. That would be pretty hard, huh?
I knew a writer one time. He finished writing his book and hit hit the towel button to save it, and it erased it. So that's a
Oh no.
nightmare. That's a writer's nightmare right there. Okay, absolutely.
Oh, brutal right there, man. Yeah, that would be pretty traumatic,
Make sure what button you're pushing. Definitely.
man. Yes, that would be absolutely horrific right there. That is for sure. Well, my friend, is there anything else you would like to touch base on tonight? Any new projects you'd like to update anybody on before we let you get going? Or
Well, that's that book I'm writing on now called Paracryptidology. I combined that. I looked at the different fields of the paranormal and the cryptology, UFOlogy, and all those. I've always been interested in all of them. But I looked at some of these communities and they were closed off like that. So I don't do UFOs. I only do cryptids, or I don't do paranormal. I only do. They close themselves off, and I don't like that. That's not a good way to be. It's not definitely a good way to look at all of this stuff, because I never did that. I wanted all the whole pie, not just a slice of it. Okay, and I think that's the way we all need to approach that. We don't need to close ourselves off. We don't need to put our minds in a box. Absolutely not.
yes, that is the truth. I mean, why not have some cake with your pie? I'm not too much of a sweets person, but I will say the flavor of birthday cake is definitely something I do enjoy. And on my birthday, I usually definitely have some cake that is
Mhm.
assimilated with that flavor, but I also do like ice cream cake as well.
There you go. Pie a la mode or cake a la mode. Yeah.
Yeah, I try, like I said, I try not to have sweets. I definitely usually eat as healthy as possible, meaning I would probably, I don't know, something crunchy and salty might be more appealing than the sweets.
I used to have a girlfriend. She said that was the whole purpose of dinner was dessert. Yeah. There you go.
That's so funny, man. Awesome. Well, Dr. Dennis Carroll is an extremely busy individual, and we did hold him pretty late tonight because we had a little bit of some technical difficulties to deal with. Yet, no worries. He is a bi weekly host. You can check out our previous content in the good old playlist down below, or you can head on over to Dennis's thread. Yes, that will be up in the good old description. And you can find his Facebook groups, everything you need to be caught up on Dr. Carroll's adventures. You will also see him on here again very soon because he is a bi weekly host. Yet this will be the conclusion of the meeting of the Midnight Society for the early hours of the morning. Thanks for hanging out tonight, man.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. Our conversations are great.
Ooh, my creatures of the night, I do adore every single one of you. And thank you for hanging out tonight. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, feed the truth to the algorithm. We will see you very soon.